Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi, and welcome to Alta Live. This is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. My name is Beth Spotswood. I am so excited, oddly excited, to welcome you today to the last Alta Live of the year. So glad you're joining us for the last Alta Live of the year. And today we are so excited to welcome Alta's own California Book Club editor, Anita Felicelli. Anita is here to talk about her new book. We are so excited to welcome her to discuss this exciting new collection of stories called How We Know Our Time Travelers Stories. Anita is just a little background on Anita, the author of Chimerica, a novel, and the award-winning Love Songs for a Lost Continent. She edits our California Book Club, and her short stories have appeared everywhere. Her essays, her criticism. She's a profoundly extraordinary book critic, as well as being a creative writer. And she's written for everyone that's cool and exciting, including Alta Journal. She served on the board of directors of the National Book Critics Circle from 2021 to 2024, and she is a Bay Area native. We're so excited to welcome her today in conversation with the original host of Alta Live, Heather Scott Partington. When we started Alta Live during the pandemic, it was just authors talking about their books, and they were usually 90% of the time in conversation with Heather. When the pandemic ended, she had to go back to work. She is a teacher. And we broadened Alta Live to include all sorts of things and anything from the magazine. But you've got the original Alta Live host, Heather Scott Partington, who will be in conversation with Anita. Heather is the current president of the National Book Critics Circle. She is very busy today, and she has stopped everything to dive into this conversation. Before I let them take the plunge, my pitch for Alta Journal. This is the current issue, but here's a secret. We're going to start promoting it tomorrow. Issue 30, which is the next issue, is currently live on our website. We set it live this morning, and we're working out some of the kinks today. But if you really want to go explore, our current issue is the 7 Wonders of California. And there's a lot of mini wonders packed in there as well. Visit altaonline.com and consider giving the gift of Alta Journal to yourself. If you subscribe now, you will get the brand new issue. You can also, it makes a great last minute gift. We host free events like this, the free California Book Club. Anita, who's the next guest? Who's January's guest?
It's Viet Thanh Nguyen with The Sympathizer.
Major title, major author. That's a free event that's in January. Alta Live is free. Please consider supporting our magazine. Go to altaonline.com/join. You can become a member. You can give it to your funky relatives that you haven't gotten anything for that love to read. And our new issue is super exciting. So visit Alta Online to check it out. This interview will be recorded and posted there later this afternoon. We're also going to send you an email with links to where you can buy Anita's books, read her work on Alta Online, join the California Book Club, and anything else that pops up today. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. Heather will bring me back at the end to ask those questions on your behalf. And for those of you that are regulars, you will know, let us know where you're zooming in from in the chat. From Novato, California, I am turning things over to Heather.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Anita, for being here. And hello, everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to hear a little bit about Anita's work. I know that you are not going to be sorry that you joined us. I'm in Elk Grove, California. Anita and I are both Northern California writers and friends. We've served on the National Book Critics Circle for a long time together. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to be here. So Anita, thank you so much for this book and for your willingness to answer questions about it. I think you're one of the most cerebral and creative writers that I know, so I'm excited to get into it. I'd like to start today by just asking about the genesis of the idea for this book. What was like what was the question at the heart of it, or where did this idea spring from?
Thanks, Heather, and thanks for that lovely introduction to both you and Beth. So the collection began the way most of my collections or books do, with me sort of figuring out me writing and then figuring out what the preoccupation was from the writing. So I started writing these stories about environment and technology and time travel, starting probably around 2019, but sort of increasing my efforts at the very start of the pandemic. For me, storytelling is just something that I have always done. Telling myself stories is something I had to do as an only child and who was by herself a lot. So I think during that period of time, I was writing just what interested me. And I think what interested me was what was on the news and like sort of my own like worry about what the future held. So that was, that year, 2020, was the year that we were experiencing those orange skies, those orange apocalyptic skies from the wildfires. And we were looking at, the fact that we were going to be pulling out of various important agreements related to climate change. So those are the kinds of things that were very much on my mind at the time, and they wind up, coming out in story form here.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that because it feels very much like a California, not novel, collection from that specific time. And I've had conversations with other people recently about other books that were written in this area and during that specific time. And it can be hard, I think, for people who are outside of California or even Northern California to understand exactly what the anxiety level was, especially when we were like trying to be outside as much as we possibly could so that we could keep each other healthy. And then outside became toxic. And I don't see that in the stories being like an overwhelming or it doesn't, how am I trying to say this? I feel like there's so much beauty within that tension. Like when I look at these stories, that there are moments of hope. There are so many moments of human connection. And it's interesting that there's this kind of, that you sort of feel all those, at a loss for words right now, you sort of feel all those different conflicts or struggles that affected this area at that time. But there's also this deep sense of like people looking for each other and people finding each other. And I think that that's really beautiful. I was wondering if you could talk, just to kind of carry that over. Could you talk about place, specifically? Like, I know that you're a writer that travels sometimes to places when you want to immerse yourself in them as you're writing about them. Were there some travels that you took, or did you draw on places that are really familiar to you as you were writing this book?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. And I am pretty obsessed with place, I think, for a literary fiction writer. I think we usually associate setting as like something very important to science fiction because it involves like world building and stuff. But I think from a very young age, I actually appreciated those like old-fashioned novels where there's descriptive writing about the place. And what I was trying to do here was sort of make the descriptive details do extra work, at an emotional level, or not only to conjure an image of the place, but also to give you a feeling about what's happening within the action and the dialogue of the story. And I think, I do travel a lot, but I think that has slowed down recently. And for this collection, the travels were in California because, we couldn't go anywhere. I can't fly easily anymore. So, originally, a couple of the stories were set in certain places, but then when I visited those places, like Joshua Tree, I realized, oh, this story actually belongs here. And then I was able to reconceptualize the whole story from that place or starting point. And I was better able to do it because I had like personally experienced all these sensory details myself. And so I could kind of like method act or like figure out, how would my character perceive this place given a set of circumstances.
I love that you write from so many different perspectives in this collection. You have stories that are from the point of view of people of different genders. You have, people who exist, I think, in similar environments of anxiety or of trying to go back to that idea that I was talking about before of like to find connection with the people that they should feel closest to. Do you have a philosophy about writing from different perspectives? Is that something that you could talk about a little bit, and sort of how you approached who would the people be who told these stories?
It's an interesting question. I guess I'm sort of an outlier within literary fiction right now, in the sense that I feel a lot of freedom to write from the perspective that I want to write from. And I'm not thinking about it as a tick the boxes. I must have this character with this marginalization or this character with this other marginalization, but just that I write from my experience of the world. And I live in Mountain View and Palo Alto. Mountain View is filled with immigrants of all different kinds, people of different races. It's just a very diverse, it's a diverse city. And so when I write from those perspectives, I'm not really thinking of it as like a political action. It's more like, oh, characters just occurred to me in whatever different background they have. But that said, I think all the characters in this one are Tamil, which is also my ethnic affiliation. And they come from various, religious backgrounds, but my own background involves multiple religions and things related to orientation and ability and all that kind of stuff. So I think on some level, the freedom that I feel is because it would be very hard to attack me for writing outside something, except to say, oh, people who are in between things all the time, or who like live in these kind of liminal spaces that are like accorded to people who are of two castes, or people who are biracial or whatever. Like it would be very hard to say like, oh, you shouldn't write about that, because then I could write about nobody. So.
No, I love that. And I, one of the things that I love in conversations that we've had before about your work is how much you embrace imagination and how much you embrace kind of like a complete openness to, wherever a story takes you. And I think of you as a reader who reads in that way as well, who's very much like willing to keep yourself open. You're not trying to limit yourself when you pick up a story or a novel or something. You're really looking at it from an expansive, accepting, and I don't mean accepting in like a, let's all hold hands and sing kumbaya, but I mean accepting of whatever form imagination takes in a text. And I really felt that as I was reading your stories too, that like so many things can happen. And that just made me think about genre. Are you a writer I know you've written recently about genre and kind of about some of the things that you like to read, but as you are sitting down to write, is imagination the thing? Are you just following the spark of an idea? Are you thinking about genre and the context that your stories are going to fall into? I just like it if you could talk about that a little bit too.
Sure. I'm not thinking a lot about genre, but I recognize that I use a lot of genre within my stories. And I think that's just, again, goes back to that sense of freedom I have about writing, in that I don't believe in genre as something more than a marketing category. And so when I'm working on my pieces and trying to create an aesthetic experience, I feel free to draw upon various genre elements, but I'm not consciously thinking, oh, I'm now going to write a horror story. I mean, maybe somewhere in my mind, I start writing and then I realize, oh, this would be more interesting the more horror I put into it, or something like that, but yeah, I think as a critic too, you're right. I do come at every book with an open, with open hands. I really want to receive the work, however it's categorized or not categorized. And so I try to apply the same thing to my writing and sort of hope that everyone will just follow along with that attitude, even if it's hard to like find where it belongs, like on a bookshelf or whatever.
Yeah. You have a lot of creatives, a lot of artists in this work as well, like people who are writing from a place of considering how their art is perceived as it's put out into the world. I'm thinking, I know that it showed up in a couple of the stories, but I'm thinking specifically of the title story as well, and like the consideration of like how art changes, how art can be considered. And for those of you who haven't read the book, you have this person who's meeting their spouse, or they think they might be meeting their spouse, who has traveled in time and they don't really know, and they're looking to see like, are the little moments of connection, are they real in terms of like moments of connection between two people who've been together for a long time, or are they just like glances that are kind of happening in the coincidence? But one of the things that I really like about that story is you also have this tension underneath it of like, how will the art be perceived? So this person who's an artist is thinking about like what they created when they were younger, what they're creating now, how they were perceived by their spouse. So I mean, you probably, I can anticipate, I think, what you're going to say, but are you anticipating how your stories are going to be perceived when they are put out into the world? Or are you just writing them, releasing them to the world, and letting, the reader animate that story with whatever perceptions and feelings they bring to it?
You know, I'm kind of a tyrant of when I'm writing the stories of how I want things to be, and like in organizing the world within the sort of logic that I set up as opposed to like external empirical logic. But when I set it out into the world, what I really hope for is that readers bring themselves to it. I would much rather, you know, people have their own interpretations. And I definitely include things that I know are ambiguities for the reason that I personally love ambiguous stories. I love being able to bring in my own self into the reading. And that way, I think, you know, reading is really an act of communion between two minds, right? It's not really my vision alone that's important to the book. You know, and I think like in academia, that's sort of been, there's been movements where you have like teaching, you know, English undergrads or whatever to interpret an author's intention. But then you also have like reader response theory or something like that. And I think it's some joining of that that's kind of a magical communion between two minds that I'm going for. And I'm very excited when I read a interpretation that I wouldn't have thought of myself.
Yeah. You're reminding me of, so Anita and I went when we were down in Southern California a couple of years ago to a performance of, is it called Selected Shorts? Is that the series?
Yes.
There was an actress, Kristen Vangenis, is that how you say her name? Who was performing one of the stories. And can you tell the story of the ladies that came up to us afterwards? Because it fits with what you're talking about. And I thought it was so lovely.
Oh my gosh, that was such a good night. And thank you again for coming with me to go see that.
It was wonderful.
Yeah, no, afterward, so I wasn't sure how to gauge the audience's reaction. And part of it was that I have never had my own stories read back to me before. So that was sort of an interesting experience. And afterwards, this group of maybe like 4 or 5 older women came up to me. At first, you know, I think they might have actually known Kirsten. It wasn't clear to me, but after we talked to her, we started walking, and this group of older women came up and said, you know, that was a really interesting story. So tell me what is supposed to happen at the end. Is she crazy, or or is there really such a thing as time travel? And I was just like, well, that's really up to you. Like, so we had this like long conversation about that. And she's like, well, I know that some people like to keep their endings ambiguous. And I was like, yeah, that's me. and they kept trying to like sort of figure it out. I did actually give them an answer, but I'm not going to give an answer generally. So
it was so great. It
did
was
I,
such
Heather?
a,
Actually, you might actually remember whether I gave an answer. Maybe I just sort
I
of
don't, because you had
I don't
kind of
know.
stepped off to talk with them, but I thought that was such a great moment too, because it really speaks to that idea that like a story is only a story when we read it, right? Like when we bring our own assumptions and what we think is happening. And so many moments in this collection just made me think about how surreal real life, I mean, nature is, how surreal it is to parent, how surreal it is to love someone enough that you decide that you want to spend your life with them. That there are things about it, you know, that these characters are like creating holograms for people who've passed on, or they are like trying to tally. There's a story where a couple downloads an app where they're going to tally like points for, you know, who's doing what in the relationship, and they're going to love each other the most, you know, and they're not going to lose, they're going to win at loving each other. And but you know, so much of that is grounded in sort of the ridiculousness of the human condition too. And I think it's really great that all these elements of sci-fi and of fantasy is not the right word, but imagination are a way to sort of help us as we're reading these, like these stories, feel what is kind of surreal in our own lives, and how like just human feeling is sort of surrendering to something that doesn't, it's not logical always, you know, it doesn't always make sense in a way that we can just go, okay, it's black and white. And I just think that it's really lovely. That I think also of the first story is called the one with the wave. What is the title? Until the Seas Rise.
Right.
And there's this impending tsunami wave that's coming, and there's this like desire to, you know, for a character to tell what their feelings are before it's too late. And I don't know, I really love that there are so many elements that speak to human vulnerability in the collection. So if we're talking about like imagination and genre and all of that, I just wondered, is there was time travel, was there a specific reason that time travel was what you were drawn to so much, or these kind of like sliding doors moments that became the thing in this collection?
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, it goes back to 2020 and what a horrendous year it was, and how much I didn't really want to be in in 2020, the first 8 months of it or whatever. But I had been feeling that feeling, for pretty much the entirety of the Trump term. Um, so I think it comes out of that. It comes out of sort of having a lot of rumination about how things could have gone differently. And I think that's sort of, I don't remember who said that about how you could live life twice through your writing of it, but I think that's part of what I was doing, was going over things that felt pivotal and interesting to me in that particular moment, and sort of playing with ways in which they could go a different way, and usually they didn't, the way that I wrote them, they didn't go that way in real life if they were drawn from any sort of like autobiographical element. But yeah, I think just that sort of space to play is what I strive for in my own fiction writing.
I love that. Has your work as a critic and an editor affected sort of the trajectory that you're on as an artist? I mean, Anita is an amazing editor of the California Book Club. She was an amazing board member to work with. She was the fiction chair for the National Book Critics Circle. Her writing is phenomenal. I encourage you to seek out her criticism as well. It's, she's one of the most thoughtful critics I know. I'm just wondering how you think about how those things affect your fiction. Is there a line? Do have things bled over as you've encountered all these writers with the California Book Club, or other aspects of your critical and editorial career?
Yeah, I actually think of all of those things as one thing. I mean, I also ghostwrite for other people, and I think of that as a different thing than these other projects. But criticism and writing fiction and writing reviews in general, I think all of that feeds each other, because the more that you read other people's work, the more you see the more you see yourself. I feel, like when you see how an author has chosen to handle a particular problem in their own work, and you are sort of considering whether you think that was a good way to handle it or not. I think that kind of like reverts back to when you are revising your own fiction, right? And that's, for me, I write so much and I am moody enough that, like, from day to day, I don't totally feel like the person who wrote the collection, which has been super helpful in editing and revising, in the sense that I bring like this sort of feeling of being a new self to each time that I work on it. And then I can also bring back, these lessons that I learned from evaluating other people's work or analyzing other people's work. And so I think of it as like one swirling, coalesced thing. but I don't, I think also, like, because I'm a fiction writer, I take a lot of special care to make sure that when I am making those sort of judgments or critiques of other people's work, that I'm not just simply going like, well, if I was the writer, I would have done X, Y, Z, but rather sort of thinking about what their aesthetic goal and project was, and then sort of working in my own response to that.
Talk about why you went with the press that you went with, and your philosophy about publishers.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I went with the press that published Chimerica. I submitted my collection anonymously, but I submitted it because the press's editor, she writes in a somewhat similar vein. So I felt like it was going to be the right fit. Short story collections are very hard to sell. And I just wanted it to find a good home with an editor who would really appreciate it, or who would really take good care of it at an artistic level. So that's why I went with WTAW Press, but I did submit to them on it anonymously, and they accepted it, not knowing that it was me, other than to the extent they could recognize the way I write or whatever in it. So,
oh, that's great. That's really cool. What are you working on now? I know you have a couple of other projects in the works.
Yeah, I always have, like, I can't go without multiple projects in the works. I just, I don't know, I would lose my mind. But I have a novel that just went in its rewritten form back to my agent, and sort of fingers crossed that she likes this version. It would be really sad if she doesn't, because I've been working really hard on it this year. And one of the reason as you know, that I stepped off the board was so that I would have some time in the evenings to work on that, rather than focus on as many books as we read on the board. And then I have another, and now that that's out of my hands, it left me 2 weeks ago to my agent's judgment. I have another novel that I'm working on that's I'm hoping is going to be really different from these other books.
Awesome. Are you have you read anything lately that has just knocked your socks off? Are there any titles that come to mind that you want to recommend from 2024 or otherwise just things that you've been interested in lately?
Sure. Yeah, I just read and reviewed Brandon Shimoda's The Afterlife is Letting Go. And as I said in the review, I thought that it was a really powerful essay collection. He takes a lot of formal risks, which is something I like a lot as both as a critic and as a fiction writer. So he takes a lot of these risks, like he does these things with bringing in other Japanese Americans' perspectives and layering quote after quote after quote. But then he also, as a poet, has just a very beautiful, distinctive voice that he brings out and shares things that we don't often talk about in our ordinary conversations related to the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans and how views of that have changed over time. The idea even of memorializing. He has some really great stuff about monuments in there. I also, then this might sound a little odder, is that I just finished What in Me is Dark by Orlando Reed, which is like a book on sort of the influence of John Milton's Paradise Lost. And it's like,
Oh,
it's not
cool.
as, I think it's not as analytical as maybe I prefer, because I just really enjoy things that are like more weighted towards criticism, but it's a history, a very accessible history on these different revolutionary thinkers and how that book affected their thoughts. And I love it. It was really enjoyable.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. And just to let everyone know, Anita reviewed the first book that she was talking about, the Brandon, is it Shimoda?
I think it's
Shimada?
Brandon Shimoda. I've never.
Shimoda book for the LA Times, and her review of it is wonderful as well. I would highly recommend that you seek out that review because it's just great too. I loved it.
Thank
So
you.
made me want to check out the book. Well, I think that that's a good place for us to bring Beth back and see if we have some questions from the audience. Thank you
Hi.
so much, Anita.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you both so much for that really fascinating interview. Okay, Anita, questions for you. How do you decide are there any stories that didn't make the cut that you kind of wish had? Is there something that's like in your file that you're like, oh, this is such a great story, but it didn't, for whatever reason, make the book?
No, there are no stories that I wanted to be in the book that I didn't get to put in there. There were two stories that my editor didn't love the way they were, and so they're completely rewritten, almost completely rewritten. Although there's certain seeds of like the past version of them there, and they're the Moment and The Night the Movers Came, the two stories in the collection. I did have other realistic stories that I could have put in there because they're similarly about time, but I didn't want to put them in there. I didn't want to revisit them, and I would much rather be working on sort of something fantastical about time than these more kind of like realistic, like I guess we now consider all of that kind of stuff literary fiction, but to me, sort of academic literary fiction in the sense of like people living in the suburbs and their, daily interpersonal interactions. And so, but I didn't want to put those in the collection in the first place, really. So,
Do you always have stories knocking around in your head? And are they like running parallel to one another? You know what I mean? I mean, I'm not a creative writer, like I don't write fiction, but how do you keep track of like your imagination?
oh, yes, I actually do always have stories knocking around my head. Even now, I'm probably like creating some sort of story around this event. This is just how my mind works. But usually it won't actually go onto a piece of paper unless I become obsessed with it. So I kind of rely on the story to come back to me. If it's really something that I know I must continue to pursue and have some sort of fear that it's on the borderline of being forgotten, I take out a notebook and write it down. But a lot of the time, it's just the persistence of the story, the fact that the story comes back to me that results in it being an actual written story later.
It's kind of like what we were talking about before we went live. If like we were saying that sometimes we'll mention something and then it will pop up in our email or we'll get an ad for it. Perhaps your imagination has like Alexa or whatever. And if you say it out loud or manifest, well, and it's meant to be, it will return to you somehow. It'll keep appearing and hint you along to write the story.
Oh, absolutely.
We are out of time. Thank you so much for those book recommendations. And for those that didn't write them, I got a DM. What were those books that you mentioned? Don't worry, this has been recorded. Our wonderful colleague, Liz Casillas, is taking copious notes. And we're going to write up an email to shoot you this afternoon with links to all of this. So never fear, we're a full service organization here at Alta Journal. We will send you links to all of this, as well as a recording of Heather and Anita's interview today. Have a great holiday and New Year for those of you that celebrate both of those things. Join us next year. Our issue 30 is up online right now, altaonline.com. Next year, I just got an email confirming our first Alta Live will be January 8th, and we will be discussing the wonders of their current issue is about the 7 wonders of California, and there are dozens of wonders in there. We're going to talk about food people, food we eat, the food of the West and California. So that's January 8th. Join us at Alta Live. And thanks so much for tuning in today. It's been a great year and a particularly great episode with my 2 good friends and colleagues. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anita. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Heather.
Take care.
Thanks.
It's wonderful.